No cameras, no reporters, no applause. Just a thick wooden door closing inside the White House, sealing off a moment that history was never meant to see. Inside that room stood the most powerful man in America, stressed, cornered, and running out of options. The Vietnam War was tearing the country apart. Protests filled the streets. Young men were refusing to fight. Trust in leadership was collapsing by the day. And standing across from him was a man the government once called a traitor. Muhammad Ali didn't arrive with a team of lawyers or political allies. No entourage, no demands. He walked in wearing calm-like armor, steady eyes, relaxed shoulders, the quiet confidence of someone who had already lost everything once and survived. This meeting was supposed to be simple. The president wanted help, a public appearance, a photograph, a few words that could calm a furious nation and bring young Americans back in line. Anything that could stop the bleeding. At first the tone was formal, polite, controlled, but beneath it sat desperation, because Ali wasn't just a boxer anymore. He was a symbol. To millions he represented courage, the kind that says no when saying yes would be easier, the kind that stands alone when the cost is your career, your title, your freedom. The president spoke about unity, about duty, about responsibility. Ali listened without interrupting. Then the pressure started. Subtle at first, promises, rehabilitation, a chance to make things right, hints that the past could be forgiven if Ali played his part. Still, Ali said nothing. Minutes passed. The air grew heavier. Advisors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't how these meetings were supposed to go. People usually folded by now, but Ali didn't, and that's when something unbelievable happened. The president stood up. His voice cracked, not loudly, but enough to be heard. Enough to change the room. He spoke not as a leader, but as a man watching control slip through his fingers. And then, slowly, painfully, he lowered himself down, onto his knees. Not for the cameras, not for history books, but for Ali. The room froze. No one breathed. No one moved. The most powerful office in the world had just bowed to a man it once tried to silence. Ali looked down at him. A man who could have mocked him, exposed him, destroyed him with a single sentence. The question wasn't whether Ali had power in that moment. The question was what he would do with it. Because whatever came next wouldn't just affect a presidency. It would echo across a nation already on the brink. And what Ali chose to do right there, in that silent room, would shock the world in a way no punch ever could. To understand how that moment became possible, you have to understand the America that led up to it. The country was exhausted. Every night, televisions glowed with the same images, jungles on fire, helicopters lifting the wounded, names scrolling across the screen. The Vietnam War wasn't just overseas anymore. It had moved into living rooms, classrooms, and dinner tables. Families argued. Friends stopped speaking. Young men questioned whether the promises they were raised on were worth dying for. Trust in leadership was fading fast. College campuses erupted in protest. Streets filled with signs, chants, anger. The government called it disorder. The people called it awakening. And caught in the center of it all was one name that refused to go away. Muhammad Ali. Once celebrated as a national hero, he had become one of the most controversial figures in America almost overnight. When he refused the draft, it wasn't just a legal decision. It was a moral line drawn in public. He said he had nothing against the Vietnamese. He said his faith wouldn't allow him to fight a war he didn't believe in. For that, he paid dearly. His heavyweight title was stripped. His boxing license was revoked. He was banned from the sport at the peak of his career. Endorsements vanished. Newspapers turned on him. Politicians labeled him unpatriotic, dangerous, even traitorous. But something unexpected happened. Instead of disappearing, Ali grew larger. To young people, minorities, and anyone who felt unheard, he became proof that one voice could stand against an entire system. He spoke plainly, without fear. He didn't soften his words to be accepted. And the more pressure the government applied, the more powerful his silence became. Meanwhile, inside the White House, pressure was building in a different way. Approval ratings were slipping. Advisors warned that the nation was fracturing beyond repair. The war needed support, or at least obedience. The president didn't just need policies anymore, he needed symbols. And Ali was the most powerful symbol of resistance in the country. If Ali could be seen supporting unity even quietly, it would change everything. One appearance, one statement, one photograph. That's all it would take to calm the anger, to reframe the narrative. That's why this meeting was arranged. Not officially, not publicly, quietly. Ali was invited under the pretense of reconciliation. A chance to talk. A chance, perhaps, to heal old wounds. But everyone in that room knew the truth. This wasn't about forgiveness. It was about control. From the moment Ali entered the White House, the contrast was impossible to miss. Polished halls, stern faces, measured voices, Power expressed through formality and silence. Ali walked through it all without hesitation. No arrogance. No fear. He wasn't there to beg for anything. He had already lost what could be taken from him. Titles, money, status, those were gone. What remained was his conviction. And that made him dangerous in a way no opponent in the ring ever had been. The president believed authority came from position, from office, from command. Ali believed authority came from truth and the courage to stand by it. That difference mattered. Because when two men enter a room believing they hold power, only one of them is usually wrong. And in the quiet moments before that unbelievable act, before pride collapsed into desperation, the stage was already set for a confrontation that would never be written into official records, but would quietly reshape how power, respect, and courage were understood in America. The meeting didn't begin with tension. It began with control. The president sat back in his chair, hands folded, voice measured and calm. This was familiar ground for him. Closed rooms, difficult conversations, people eventually bending under the weight of authority. Muhammad Ali sat across from him, relaxed, almost casual, not slouched, not stiff, just present. As if this room, this office that commanded the world, held no power over him at all. The president spoke first. He talked about the country, about division, about how dangerous things were becoming. He framed the war as necessity, protest as chaos, and obedience as patriotism. Every word was chosen carefully, polished by years of politics. Ali listened. No nodding, no shaking his head, no interruption. That silence unsettled the room. The president shifted gears. He spoke about Ali's past, his achievements, his influence, his lost title. He mentioned how things had gone too far, how mistakes were made on both sides. The implication was clear. The door to redemption was open. All Ali had to do was walk through it. Still, Ali didn't speak. Advisors exchanged quick glances. This wasn't resistance the way they expected. There was no argument to dismantle, no anger to diffuse, just patience. And patience in that room felt like defiance. The president leaned forward. His voice grew firmer, less polish. He spoke about responsibility, about young men watching Ali following his example. He suggested carefully that Ali's stance was encouraging disobedience. That silence carried consequences. That history might not be kind. Ali finally moved. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't challenge the president directly. He simply said that he never told anyone to refuse anything. He only chose for himself. And he would live with that choice. The simplicity of it landed harder than any speech. The president's jaw tightened. This wasn't how power worked. People negotiated. People compromised. People protected what they could still save. But Ali had already accepted loss, and a man with nothing left to lose is impossible to threaten. The room grew colder. The president stood up and began pacing slowly behind his desk. He spoke faster now, frustration leaking through the cracks. He warned that public opinion could turn again. That forgiveness wasn't guaranteed. That doors, once closed, didn't always reopen. Ali looked at him, not defiantly, not angrily, but with something close to pity. That look changed everything. The president stopped pacing. For the first time, the balance in the room shifted. Authority no longer felt solid. The office no longer felt untouchable. The word stopped working. And then the president did something no one expected. He dropped the titles, the talking points, the rehearsed arguments. He spoke as a man who was losing control of a country and knew it. He admitted the protests were growing, that the war was costing more than lives, it was costing belief. He admitted they needed voices people trusted, not politicians, not generals, someone like Ali. The silence returned, heavier than before. Because now the truth was out. This wasn't about persuading Ali. This was about needing him. The president walked around the desk and stood directly in front of Ali. No barrier, no furniture. Just two men facing each other. He asked, quietly, if Ali understood what was at stake. Ali answered just as quietly that he did. Another pause, advisors held their breath. This was the edge. The moment where ego usually stepped in, where power reasserted itself. But instead of rising, the president hesitated. His shoulders dropped slightly. His voice softened. And in that hesitation, the unthinkable began. Because the man who commanded armies, who signed orders that shaped nations, was about to do something that would never appear in transcripts, never be admitted publicly, and never be forgotten by anyone in that room. The conflict had reached a point where authority no longer mattered. Only choice did. And the next movement, slow, deliberate, irreversible, would change the meaning of power for everyone watching. No one could say exactly when it happened, only that, suddenly, the air in the room felt different. The president stood there, facing Muhammad Ali, his words exhausted, his arguments spent. The confidence that usually filled the room had drained away, replaced by something raw and unfamiliar. Silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, pressing against everyone present. Ali remained seated, not out of disrespect, not out of strategy. He simply didn't move. And that stillness did more than shouting ever could. The president looked around briefly, as if searching for an answer somewhere in the walls. The flags, the portraits of former leaders staring down from history. None offered help. The authority of the office, so powerful moments earlier, felt suddenly hollow. He took a slow breath, then another, and then, without warning, he stepped forward. The movement alone sent a ripple through the room. Advisors stiffened. One of them half rose from his chair before stopping himself. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't planned. This wasn't supposed to happen. The president stopped directly in front of Ali. For a moment, they were close enough to hear each other breathe. And then, in a motion so slow it felt unreal, the president bent his knees. At first, no one understood what they were seeing. Surely he was adjusting his stance. Surely he had dropped something. Surely this was some kind of pause before another speech. But then he continued downward. One knee touched the floor, then the other. The room froze. Time didn't stop, but it fractured. Seconds stretched thin, almost transparent. No one moved. No one spoke. The sound of fabric shifting as the president settled on the floor echoed louder than it should have. He was kneeling, not figuratively, not symbolically, literally, in front of Muhammad Ali, the most powerful man in the country, reduced not by force but by necessity. His voice came out low, barely above a whisper. He spoke about the country, not in grand terms, not in slogans, but in fragments. About fear, about chaos, about a nation slipping away faster than anyone could hold it together. He didn't command. He didn't command, he asked. He asked Ali to help calm the storm, to stand with the country, to give people something to believe in again, not as a politician, as a man. Ali looked down at him. This was the moment no one could prepare for. The room expected anger, or triumph, or at least a sharp reminder of how roles had reversed. But Ali's face showed none of that. No smile, no satisfaction, only thought. He saw the man on the floor not as an enemy, but as someone trapped by the very power he wielded, someone who had climbed so high he no longer knew how to step back without falling. Ali didn't rush. He let the silence do its work. Every second the president remained kneeling stripped the moment of politics and turned it into something deeply human. Pride dissolved. Titles vanished. What remained was vulnerability, exposed and undeniable. Advisors stared at the floor. One clenched his hands together, unsure whether he was witnessing a collapse or a turning point. Another looked at Ali, silently pleading for him to end this before it became something irreversible. But Ali didn't move. Not yet. Because he understood something no one else in that room did. This wasn't about winning. This was about what kind of power the world would remember. Finally, Ali spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to be heard. He said that kneeling didn't erase what had already happened. That apologies didn't undo lost years or silenced voices. That unity couldn't be built on fear or convenience. The president stayed where he was, listening. Ali continued calmly, explaining that respect given under pressure wasn't respect at all. That true leadership didn't beg for symbols, it lived by principles. And then Ali paused. The longest pause yet. Everyone waited for the final blow. The refusal. The rejection that would seal this moment as one of humiliation. Instead, Ali did something no one expected. He leaned forward. Not to dominate. Not to mock. But to speak as one human being to another. And in that quiet exchange, one man on his knees, the other choosing his words carefully, the meaning of strength began to shift. Because the shock of the moment wasn't that power had fallen. It was that restraint had risen. And whatever Ali chose to do next would define not just this meeting, but the kind of legacy both men would leave behind. Muhammad Ali didn't answer right away. He stayed leaning forward, elbows resting lightly on his knees, eyes steady on the man kneeling before him. The room was so quiet that even the faint hum of the lights overhead felt intrusive. No one dared interrupt. This was no longer a political meeting. It was a reckoning. Ali's mind moved inward. He remembered the courtroom where strangers decided his future without knowing his heart. He remembered the headlines that called him a coward, the crowds that once cheered his name now booing it. He remembered losing his title, his income, and years of his prime, not because he failed in the ring, but because he refused to betray himself. He also remembered something else. The letters. Young men writing to him from small towns and big cities, saying his stand made them feel less alone. Parents thanking him for speaking with honesty when leaders would not. Strangers telling him that for the first time they felt seen. All of that sat with him now. Across from him, the president remained still. He had not tried to stand. He had not spoken again. Whatever pride he once carried into the room had been set aside, perhaps permanently. He was waiting, not as a leader but as a man hoping for mercy. Ali finally straightened. He spoke slowly, choosing each word with care, as if placing stones across a river. He said he never hated the country. He said he loved it enough to question it. He explained that his refusal was never about defiance for its own sake. It was about conscience. About being able to look at himself in the mirror when everything else was stripped away. He told the president that kneeling could not undo punishment, and forgiveness could not be demanded as a favor. Respect had to be mutual, or it meant nothing. The president nodded once faintly. Ali continued. He said that if he agreed to help simply to restore order, nothing would change. The anger would quiet for a moment, then return stronger than before. Because peace built on silence was fragile, because unity forced from fear was not unity at all. Another pause. Advisors shifted, unsure where this was heading. Some feared a total refusal. Others feared an agreement that came with conditions no one wanted to hear. Ali looked around the room briefly, then back down again. He said he would not stand beside anyone who asked young men to die while refusing to hear why they were afraid. He would not become a symbol to erase protest or cover injustice. Then he said something unexpected. He said he would speak, but only in truth. Not to recruit, not to command, not to soften the message. He would speak about conscience, about choice, about the cost of war, not just in lives lost but in souls damaged. He would speak as himself, not as a tool of the state. The room held its breath. This was not the agreement anyone had prepared for. Ali added that he would never pretend his stand had been a mistake. He would never apologize for choosing faith and principle over obedience. If the country wanted his voice, it would have to accept it unedited. Silence followed. The president closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of what was being offered. This wasn't control. This wasn't a clean solution. This was risk, uncertainty, exposure. But it was also honest. Slowly, the president placed his hands on his knees and stood. No one helped him. He rose on his own. The moment of kneeling ending not with triumph or shame, but with acceptance. He said he understood. Whether he truly did or not hardly mattered anymore. Ali stood as well. For the first time since entering the room, the two men stood on equal ground, not because power had been shared, but because it had been redefined. Ali extended his hand. Not in forgiveness, not in alliance, but in acknowledgement. The president took it. The handshake was brief, firm, quiet. No cameras captured it, no record preserved it. Yet everyone in the room understood they had witnessed something rare. Not a victory, a boundary. Ali gathered his coat and prepared to leave. As he reached the door, he turned back once. Not dramatically, not for effect. He said that real change would never come from forcing people to fall in line. It would come when leaders listened to why people stood apart. Then he walked out. The door closed behind him, and the room exhaled all at once. The president remained standing, staring at the door long after Ali was gone. Because for the first time, the most powerful man in the country had not gotten what he wanted. He had gotten something harder, the truth. And the shock wasn't that Ali refused to kneel. It was that, when given absolute power over the moment, he chose restraint over revenge and principle over pride. The room did not return to normal after Muhammad Ali left. It couldn't. For several long seconds, no one spoke. Advisors remained where they were, standing or seated in half-finished movements, as if the air itself had thickened. The door through which Ali had exited looked heavier now, as though it carried weight instead of wood. The president was the first to move. He walked back toward his desk slowly, not with the sharp confidence that usually followed difficult meetings, but with measured steps, as if each one required thought. He sat down without speaking, hands resting flat in front of him, eyes unfocused. No one congratulated him. No one offered strategy. There was nothing to spin. What had just happened did not fit into talking points or press releases. It could not be framed as a win or a loss without diminishing it. The advisors understood that instinctively. Whatever power usually lived in that room had been interrupted, and everyone felt it. Finally, one aide cleared his throat and asked what the next step should be. The president didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quieter than anyone expected. He said they would proceed carefully. That no statements would be made. That nothing from this meeting would leave the room. Not yet. Because while Ali had walked away without making demands, the implications of his words were already spreading, silently, invisibly through the conscience of everyone who had heard them. In the days that followed, subtle changes appeared. Meetings shifted tone, language softened. Advisors who once spoke only in numbers and outcomes began mentioning public trust, moral cost, long-term damage. Not everyone agreed. Some resisted fiercely. But something had cracked, and cracks have a way of widening even when ignored. Outside the White House, Ali returned to his life without announcement. He didn't give interviews about the meeting. He didn't hint at it in speeches. He didn't let it become mythology. To the public, he was still the same man, outspoken, controversial, firm in his beliefs. But those closest to him noticed a difference. Ali seemed lighter, not relieved but settled. He had been tested not by fists or courts, but by power offered at its most vulnerable. And he had passed that test quietly, without applause. Word began to spread anyway. Not officially. Not clearly. Whispers moved through political circles, then into journalistic ones. Not details, no one dared provide those, but impressions. Stories of a meeting that did not go as planned, of a man who refused to bend when bending would have restored everything he'd lost. The narrative around Ali shifted again. Slowly, cautiously. People began to talk less about what he had refused and more about why. Young people listened more closely. Even some who disagreed with him found it harder to dismiss him as reckless or selfish. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't attacking. He was standing. Inside the administration, the president carried the moment differently. He did not speak of it publicly, but it followed him. In pauses, in hesitations, in moments where certainty used to live and now did not. The image of kneeling, never captured, never recorded, became something he could not escape, because it had not been imposed on him. He had chosen it. And choice has consequences that commands do not. Some advisors later said that from that point forward, discussions about unity changed. They were no longer framed solely around control or optics. There was more caution, more awareness of how quickly authority could turn brittle when detached from respect. The war did not end that day. Protests did not vanish. The nation did not heal overnight. But something shifted beneath the surface. Ali's refusal to become a symbol on someone else's terms had preserved something rare: credibility. He had not traded his principles for comfort, nor used power for humiliation. That restraint gave his voice weight that could not be manufactured. Years later, when people tried to understand why Ali's influence endured long after his boxing career ended, they often pointed to moments like this, not the famous ones, not the televised ones, but the unseen ones. Moments where he had everything to gain and chose not to take it. Moments where he could have crushed pride and instead exposed it gently. Back in the White House, the president eventually returned to routine. Meetings resumed. Decisions were made. History continued moving forward, as it always does. But there were nights, according to those closest to him, when he sat alone longer than usual, staring at nothing in particular. And in those moments, the weight of that kneeling lingered, not as shame, but as a reminder. That authority can demand compliance, but only integrity can earn respect. Ali never spoke of the meeting again. He didn't need to, because the aftermath wasn't written in documents or headlines. It lived in changed tones, altered choices, and a quiet understanding among those who had witnessed the exchange. That power, when stripped of fear and force, becomes something else entirely, and that the most lasting victories often leave no visible mark, only a different way of standing, long after the moment has passed. Years passed, and the moment remained hidden from history books. No footage surfaced. No documents were released. No official account ever confirmed what truly happened behind that closed door. And yet, the impact of that encounter continued to ripple quietly through time, carried not by headlines, but by the way people remembered Muhammad Ali. Because Ali was never just a boxer. He was a mirror that forced the world to look at itself when it was most uncomfortable. People often talk about strength as dominance, about power as the ability to make others bend. But that meeting revealed something far more unsettling. That true strength is the ability to stand firm, when everything around you is designed to make you kneel. Ali had every reason to take revenge in that room. He had been humiliated publicly, punished professionally, and stripped of years he could never get back. If anyone had earned the right to savor power when it finally appeared, it was him. But he didn't. And that choice is what defined him. He showed that dignity doesn't rise from winning arguments or humiliating opponents. It rises from refusing to become the very thing that tried to break you. In a world obsessed with domination, Ali chose restraint. In a moment built for ego, he chose principle. That lesson reached far beyond politics. It spoke to anyone who had ever been underestimated. Anyone who had been pressured to compromise their values for approval, safety, or success. Anyone who had been told that silence was easier, that obedience was smarter, that resistance was pointless. Ali proved otherwise. He proved that saying no can echo louder than shouting ayes. That standing alone can inspire millions. That power offered at the wrong price is not power at all. The president returned to history as leaders do, measured by policies, decisions, and outcomes. Debated, criticized, re-examined. Ali returned to something rarer, a symbol of conscience. Long after the politics of that era faded, Ali's stand continued to speak to new generations. Not because he was flawless. Not because he was always right. but because he was honest about what he believed and brave enough to accept the cost. That meeting never became legend because Ali never needed it to. His legacy was already written in how he lived before and after that moment. He reminded the world that respect is not something you demand from a position of authority. It is something you earn through consistency, humility, and courage, especially when no one is watching. And perhaps the greatest irony of all is this: the moment of kneeling did not diminish power. It exposed where power truly lived, not in an office, not in a title, not in the ability to command, but in the courage to choose principle over pride. That is why Ali's name still carries weight decades later. That is why his words are still quoted, his stance still debated, his courage still admired. Because when the world tried to force him into a corner, he didn't lash out. He stood still, and in doing so, he moved history. If this story made you pause, even for a moment, then it did what Ali always hoped his life would do: make people think, not follow blindly. More powerful stories like this are coming, stories about courage, restraint, and moments that quietly reshape the world. Tell us in the comments which part of this story hit you the hardest, and what lesson you're taking with you. Your feedback helps shape what we bring next. And remember, real strength isn't loud, it's unshakable.